An unwinding. A lack of control. Vivid hallucinations. Release. All of these feelings and experiences somehow all tie back to the preconceived notions that shape our society's stigmatized drug culture. Darren Aronofsky's psychological thriller horror film, The Black Swan, focuses on Nina Sayers, a frail and innocent ballerina that manages to grab the lead role, the Swan Queen, in a new production of Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake. However, Nina struggles throughout the entire film in trying to emulate the intense, carefree ferocity of the Black Swan. The director of the play views her pure essence as a sign of weakness and pressures her to let go.
You could be brilliant, but you're a coward. Now stop saying that! That's exactly what I'm talking about! Stop being so fucking weak! Again!
In her quest to achieve artistic perfection and becoming the Black Swan, Nina slowly starts to become deranged, experiencing hallucinations, to the point where she becomes haunted by her suppressed Black Swan. The movie isn't centralized on drug abuse or addiction, but this pressure of release and letting go, her addiction to perfection, and the hallucinations that she experiences becomes analogous to the path that drug addicts take: exposure, addiction, isolation, and ultimately self-destruction. Nina's entire whole life has been set on control and discipline. She has an irrational and compulsive obligation to make every step and move as perfect as possible.
Just want to be perfect.
You what?
Want to be perfect.
This compulsive attitude of control and discipline is rooted from her own mother's compulsive attitude of control and discipline towards her. Although a grown adult, Nina is forcibly still treated as though she's still a child by her mother, who's obsessed with maintaining her daughter's innocence in close proximity. Each attempt of independence that Nina takes is quickly shot down and suppressed, building up her innocent, mentally weak, and frail character. Although this soft feature is a strength to when she plays the White Swan, it becomes a pit of her performance when playing the Black Swan. The play director becomes frustrated with her need to make everything perfect, and urges her throughout the entire movie to
Let it go! Let it go! Let it go! And... Perfection is not just about control. It's also about letting go.
He introduces her to another fellow ballerina, Lily, whose movements match exactly how the Black Swan should be.
Imprecise, but effortless.
Aronofsky initially introduces drugs as the pathway to release and liberation. Throughout the movie, Lily notices Nina's confined nature and peer pressures Nina into taking ecstasy. This is the only explicit drug scene that happens in the movie, but it becomes incredibly significant since it uses drugs as a key to release. After taking ecstasy, Nina becomes incredibly bold and brazen. She becomes promiscuous at the nightclub that they're in, and finally manages to have enough courage to stand up for herself from her mother's irrational control over her.
What's this?
It's called privacy. I'm not 12 anymore.
You're not my Nina right
Leave me alone!
Although this side of Nina is only short-term due to the drug's temporary effects, it becomes one of the first steps for Nina in helping her capture the fierce essence of the Black Swan. One of the many beliefs surrounding drugs is that it unleashes a side of us that is imprecise but effortless. Nina's use of drugs and getting high to break confinement and achieve liberation was simply an attempt to be something greater than she normally is, the Black Swan. The use of drugs in the film provided the means for Nina to attain perfection. After being bombarded with so many
Let it go! Let it go!
she synonymized release with the Black Swan. Our current drug culture plays a critical role here, since most of the preconceived notions about drugs lie in their intrinsic associations with release and liberation. There exists a common thought that getting high will free a person from their normal dispositions and loosen up their sense of control.
It'll relax you. It'll loosen you up.
These cultural assumptions concerning drugs influence Nina to fall under Lily's pressure. However, she takes ecstasy and loses control not as a way to de-stress, but as a way to further fuel her addiction in perfecting her craft. She takes drugs in order to live vicariously through the Black Swan. Ecstasy was simply the means to the end. To clarify, Nina's exposure to drugs wasn't her exposure to the explicit drugs that Lily provided, but rather her exposure to the Black Swan of herself that fulfilled her compulsive addiction to perfection. This addiction culminates into several hallucinations that haunt and terrify Nina as she slowly starts losing in touch with reality. Drugs aren't the source of these hallucinations, but Aronofsky plucks elements out of existing drug culture in order to better frame the narrative that he's ultimately trying to make. The negative beliefs surrounding drugs primarily lie in how they induce dissociation. By incorporating scenes of hallucination, Aronofsky does two things. One, he stimulates a metaphysical trip for the audience, putting them into a mix of fear and dread that entices them to the mysterious edge of the Black Swan, while simultaneously pushing them away from the dwindling humanity of the naysayers. And two, these hallucinations instill a sense of paranoia in Nina herself that turns her away from everyone around her. Both of these effects focus on the notion of isolation, a principal characteristic of drug addiction. The drug addict becomes so involved with their substance, in Nina's case the Black Swan, that they confine themselves to toxic solitude. By embedding the hallucinatory in the film, Aronofsky continues to mold Nina's addiction to perfection by further isolating her from the audience, the characters, and ultimately herself. The motif of mirrors and reflections play a large part in the film since essentially, the only battle Nina is fighting with is with herself. The drug addict becomes so engulfed with the substance that they lose any sense of reason and rationale. They prioritize their high over their own personal health, that they destroy themselves.
No, please! You're not well!
Let go of me!
I can't handle this!
I can't! I'm the Swan Queen. You're the one who never let the go.
This is mirrored by the timeline of the Black Swan's behavior as the film progresses. In the beginning, she merely passes by Nina. The drug addict usually has control over the substance near the start of their addiction. However, by the end, the Black Swan is vicious and tries to kill Nina. At this point, the substance finally has control over the addict.
It's my turn. My turn. My turn. It's my turn.
Through the inclusion of these violent encounters, Aronofsky again metaphorically alludes to the stigma of drug culture by highlighting the negative consequences of addiction. Aronofsky creates an entire atmosphere revolving around addiction and references drug culture through both explicit and implicit drug use. Although the explicit use, the ecstasy, helps fuel Nina's addiction to perfection, it is through the implicit drug, the Black Swan that Nina so desperately tries to capture, that completes her path as an addict. At the end of the film, Nina is overcome by the Black Swan and kills herself in her final journey to attain perfection. Strangely, this scene twists everything that Aronofsky had been working for. Throughout the entire film, he had been using the negative elements of drug culture, bringing up notions of addiction, isolation, and self-destruction, but interestingly enough, this last scene isn't portrayed as the pathetic death of an addict. It is a scene of elegant serenity. Nina is finally content and at peace with herself.
That was perfect.
This paradox that Aronofsky touches on brings up an interesting question. Are drug addicts more liberated than the drug culture that condemns them?